Mohammad in Australia, you are now live with Jim and Matt. How can we help? You evidently have a couple of questions, and the first one I'm told is, where did consciousness come from? Is that your first question?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about that for a while.
And my answer is, I don't know. Do you?
Okay, I can't know for certain, but I can guess based on reasons, I suppose. What I would put is that there can only be two possibilities in that it could either come from some other consciousness or from no consciousness. Would you agree with that?
How did you prove that there are only two possibilities?
Well, those are mutually exclusive. Either it came from something that is conscious or it did not come from something that is conscious.
Oh, okay. Got it.
So, yes, of course, I will accept a proper dichotomy. Either the explanation for consciousness is that it originated from some other consciousness or it originated from something other than another consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I mean, for context, I am a Muslim, but I'm not going to speak about Islam in this call. But to give you what I think it does come from another consciousness.
Why?
Okay, that's a really good question. Well, to answer that question, that really comes back to answering why I believe in the Creator. And I could, if you would like, I can give you my reasons why I think that.
I just asked for your reason. Why do you think that consciousness comes from consciousness? Because I see no evidence of that at all.
Okay, you're right. Well, for me, the notion of a creator of everything makes the most logical sense. So if I'm using logic, that conclusion would make the most sense. And
no, sir. Hang on, Mohammad. Saying that you are convinced that a God makes the most logical sense and then declaring that you're going to be logical based on that is actually fallacious and has nothing to do with logic. You are inventing a circular argument by beginning with, I believe that this is the best explanation logically, and therefore logically I will continue to go forward with that. I'm asking, why are you convinced that consciousness comes from consciousness? What is the evidence that consciousness comes from consciousness?
Okay. If you're asking for, well, I can't give you any concrete proof evidence. The only thing I can give you is the probability that I believe in the other alternative. It wouldn't add up to me. If that
I'm not interested at all, Mohammad, or so to be more specific, you keep telling me what you believe. I'm interested in why you believe it. What is the reason you believe it, not what you believe. And every time you try to go to a why, you've come up with another what every time. So I agree with you. If there is an explanation for consciousness, that explanation is either something else that is conscious or not something else that is conscious. And you've determined that the most probable explanation is that consciousness comes from consciousness. Once again, and for the last time, present the evidence, the reason why you think you can calculate probability at all or approximate probability on consciousness coming from consciousness versus not coming from consciousness. That's it. That's all you got to do.
Okay. To me, the reason I believe that consciousness comes from consciousness is purely because the other alternative makes much less sense to me than that one. That's the best I can answer for that one.
Mohammad, there is no point in continuing in this conversation because I keep asking you to give the reason why you believe something, and you have not presented anything in the neighborhood of evidence and anything in the neighborhood of data. You keep going back to, you're just not convinced that the alternative is reasonable. Well, I don't care, and neither does reality, whether or not you are convinced of it. You have to have a good reason to believe in something. And the fact that you just think that the alternative doesn't make sense is not a good reason to believe anything. That is the same reason that people give for gods all the time. Because why is there something rather than nothing? Well, it makes more sense if there's a God to create something. And so I'm just going to go with that. Because it seems that it is absurd to think that something could come from nothing without a God. But those are all fallacious arguments. Every single one of them are fallacies. Do you have data or a case for why it is reasonable to believe that consciousness comes from consciousness? Do you have an example of consciousness coming from anything?
I mean, I don't know if you'd accept this. So I would just say a simple example. For instance, I guess someone being born, I guess you could say, from their parents. I don't know.
No. That's the problem, Mohammed. My consciousness did not come from my parents' consciousness.
Oh, yeah, you're not in that sense, no.
Correct. So you just came up with a completely irrelevant example, which is actually another fallacy. So what reason do we have to think that we have, like when you said, where does consciousness come from? What was my answer?
Okay, you said you don't know.
Right. And also the question itself, the question itself presumes that consciousness comes from somewhere or from something. How did we demonstrate that? What we really should be asking is, what is consciousness and how do we explain it? And we don't know.
Could I touch up on a point just when you said that if you don't know the answer to something, for example, and like let's say there are two possibilities, would you not say that it is within reason to sort of go with one possibility over less likely over the other one?
So
no, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. So on any statement of that can have a true false to it, you can have actually three positions. And I like to throw in a fourth just because it's me. But you can accept that statement is true, that proposition is true. You can accept it as false, or you can say, I don't know. Right? And that is the most honest answer you can give when you don't know if it's true or false. I don't know is simply the most honest. Now, the fourth one that I like to throw in there is I don't care. But that really goes along with I don't know. So those are the three positions you can have on any proposition. And it's the one, and the default position is to not accept anything as true or as false until proven.
The prime example that I can think of right off the bat, Mohammad, is let's say that someone in my neighborhood was murdered last night. It is true that either I am the murderer or I am not the murderer, and those are the only two possibilities. To take your same question, is it reasonable then for you to reach a conclusion of which of those two is more probable in the absence of hard evidence for either?
I would agree with the question that you posed. I agree that because the nature of the question is very 50-50. So I would say I don't know to that one. But could I?
No, that's not. So this is already a problem. You are saying the nature of the proposition is 50-50. That is not true. That is not accurate. That is, in fact, another fallacy. The fact that there are two options does not mean that the odds are 50-50. You don't know the odds. This is one of the problems that you've done twice now, which is you presume that you can estimate the odds for something when you have no information. It is true, either I killed that person or I did not, but it would be a mistake for anyone to take up either position as if it were the truth. However, when we look at reason and justice, it is better for us to set the default position to Matt is not guilty until you demonstrate that he is. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Then God is not guilty of existing until you demonstrate that he is. God is not guilty of creating consciousness until you demonstrate that he is. And the default position is that while I don't know what the actual answer is, no proposed answer should be believed until it has strong evidence in favor of it that overcomes all the other potential explanations. And even if there's only one, that doesn't mean that the odds are 50-50, right?
Yes. Could I please add something?
Sure.
I think what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, where we differ, because we both, obviously we're both human, we have the same potential of knowing the answer to that question. Like I don't believe God has spoken to directly and said, I am God or something like that to me or you. So we don't actually have that type of evidence. Actually,
that wouldn't count as evidence. Because in the end, it would just be someone who's convinced that God talked to them, not someone who God actually talked to. You'd have to demonstrate that.
Well,
but yes.
Well, true. But we don't have, I guess, like God isn't coming out of the clouds right now as we speak.
Right. I agree. And it's comforting that you don't think God is individually talking to people to tell them what the right answer is. So.
Well, what I would think is that because we're presented with this potential for it's either one or the other, right? He exists or doesn't exist. And the way I'm coming to my conclusion, which you don't agree with, is by looking at the two possibilities and seeing which makes more probable sense. I guess to me,
this is the problem we're having is when you say it makes more probable sense, right? Is how did you determine that probability? And when Matt brought up the example of either Matt killed his neighbor or Matt did not kill his neighbor, you said that was 50-50 without any evidence whatsoever. And that's, again, simply not true, because just because there are two possibilities doesn't mean that the odds are the same. For instance, what are the odds of Matt killing his neighbor if his neighbor was killed with a hammer blow to the head and Matt has spent the last 6 months in a full body cast in a hospital? What are the odds? Are they 50-50?
They're close to zero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So you calculated the odds of 50-50 without knowing any facts whatsoever.
But it seems the thing that you're trying to get to, Mohammad, and I will let you get to it. I'll just stop right here and you can let me know if I was right, is you seem to be under this position that, hey, there has to be some explanation for consciousness, and it's either a conscious agent or it's not. And I need to make a decision right fucking now. And that's the part that's not true, because the right thing to do is to say, I cannot reasonably reach a conclusion on this. I cannot, with intellectual honesty and rigor to the standards of evidence and epistemology that are most likely to be accurate, I cannot take a position on this. I need more evidence. And that, by the way, is God's fault. The argument from divine hiddenness is this notion that God is essentially winning the longest game of hide and seek ever, that the things that God could explain or should explain have not been explained. And the thing, people are reaching out to gods on a regular basis. And so far, none of them have provided anything that we can identify as actual enlightenment from them. All we see are more and more people with their thoughts on God, and those thoughts don't align with reality, and they don't align with each other. And I would argue that Occam's razor and an assessment of the likely probability of something would lead one to conclude that gods are more likely to have been made up by human beings than to have actually existed. And what's curious is that most God believers think this of every other God other than the one that they believe.
Well, I would actually, you brought up a really interesting point, if I don't mind. I'll ask, do you think we could ever come to a point where we could actually answer that question with certainty? Where did consciousness come from?
Well, I don't think we can answer any question with certainty, but do I think we can have a good understanding and explanation of consciousness? I don't see why that's outside the realm of what could be potentially knowable, but I can't say for sure.
Okay.
And if I go to my grave never understanding consciousness, I'll be a little disappointed, but I will have still lived a life, and I will have not bought into bad ideas and bad explanations for something. If we ask, why does gravity work the way it does, and we just stopped with, that's what God wanted, well, I don't know that we'd have a good understanding of gravity and whether or not we'd have gone to the moon. I'm sorry, you broke up. Are you still there?
Like, for me personally, come to a stop where you say that's what God wanted, or that's what... Sorry?
Mohammad, your line is breaking up just a little bit. Could you just repeat what you said the last couple sentences? We couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, please continue.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I was just going to say, with that gravity example, what I would say is that you kind of need to come to a stop. I guess whether you're a theist or not, you would either say that's what God wanted, or you'd say that's how the universe works. Would you agree that that's kind of, it needs to come to a stop with one of those two explanations?
At what point do you have a way to distinguish between those two? At what point can you rule out the supernatural? The supernatural is fundamentally unfalsifiable, which is why we don't include it in potential scientific explanations currently. And so if what you're appealing to is the supernatural, no, I do not think that there is any mechanism right now that would allow anyone to come to the conclusion to either rule out the supernatural or to say that the supernatural is a better explanation. So I can't tell you what's going to happen down the line as we learn more about the universe. But as it stands now, no supernatural explanation is an actual explanation for anything, because it's an attempt to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery.
Well, I guess I keep hearing, for example, in science, there's no real question as why. So why doesn't actually exist in science, in the sense that if you ask
That's not true.
Why does gravity
That's
work?
not true.
Why does it?
That's not true. So the thing that you're talking about, why as an English word can be used in a number of different ways. You can reframe any what question or how question to be a why question. What they're really saying is science doesn't attempt to explain intent. It just explains what is and what leads to another and provides tentative explanations. So when we say science doesn't provide why, well, it does explain why my pen falls when I let go of it. The explanation is gravity. But why gravity? Well, this is the way things are. But you can frame any question that way. All it means is that science isn't interested in the meta-ethical agency intent portion as an explanation, other than why did Matt let go of his pen? And then we're talking about what an intentional agent did. But you could also say, why is there something rather than nothing? Or you could say, what is the explanation for the existence of matter and energy in the universe, which is still a why is there something rather than nothing question. So it's kind of semantics, but the only thing is science isn't saying, hey, there's intent. Until there is.
I understand. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. On that note, Mohammad, I appreciate it. And you can call back and have another conversation, but I got a bunch of other callers to get to. We only got about 20 minutes left.
That's okay. I appreciate your time, Matt and Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.